Subscribe to Hollow Whisper Tales and unlock the secrets of the night. Some doors should never be opened. Some stories should never be told. But once you start listening, you can never unhear the whispers. Story number 1: The Weaver's Well. Part 1. The Whispers in the Silk. The old house, perched on the edge of the Whispering Woods, had always been a part of Alara's life. Not her home, not exactly, but a constant, brooding presence on the horizon of her childhood. It belonged to her great Aunt Hilda, a woman of brittle bones and sharp, observing eyes, who was rumored to weave magic into her tapestries. Alara, now 22 and freshly adrift in the murky waters of post-university life, had been summoned back. Hilda, they said, was finally failing. The air within the house was thick, pregnant with dust and the scent of withered herbs. Sunlight, filtered through grime-coated windows, cast long, distorted shadows that danced like restless spirits along the aged walls. Alara found Hilda in her loom room, a cavernous space dominated by a massive, ancient loom that seemed to groan under the weight of years. Hilda herself was a frail, almost translucent figure, her skin papery thin, and her eyes, though still sharp, clouded with a strange luminescence. "So, you've come back, little spider," Hilda rasped, her voice like rustling leaves. "Did the city finally spit you out?" Alara bristled at the name, but kept her tone even. "They said you weren't well, Aunt Hilda." Hilda chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Well is a relative term. The loom, my dear, the loom is what matters now." She gestured to the tapestry she'd been working on, a chaotic swirl of crimson, indigo, and a sickly yellow that seemed to throb with a life of its own. The patterns were bewildering, abstract yet disturbingly familiar, like half-remembered dreams. "I'm finishing it." Alara had always been captivated by Hilda's tapestry, the way the threads seemed to shift and writhe even when still, as though some secret language was woven within. "What is it?" Alara asked, her voice a low hum of fascination and growing unease. "It is the well, child, the well that runs beneath us all." Hilda's gaze turned far away, her eyes focusing not on Alara, but something beyond. "It is the stories we weave, the threads of our lives, and some should never be seen." Over the next few days, Alara began to understand the true scale of her aunt's obsession. The house was filled with half-finished tapestries, each more unsettling than the last. One depicted women with eyes that seemed to weep blood, another with distorted limbs and mouths full of sharp teeth, and yet another with faces veiled in shadow, their bodies dissolving into the woven backdrop. She began to suspect that Hilda wasn't just a weaver, but something more, something that drew power from the act itself. Hilda spoke only in cryptic pronouncements, her ramblings filled with references to ancient powers, to a well of stories that runs deep beneath the world, and to the women who have always been the vessels of these forces. She spoke of the weavers, the women of her lineage who had always been connected to the loom, to the threads, to the terrible stories. One afternoon, Alara found a hidden alcove in the basement. There, on a mildewed table, was a collection of journals, bound in worn leather. Each was filled with Hilda's spidery handwriting, recounting nightmares, visions, and a history of the weaver women that ran far deeper and more disturbing than Alara had ever imagined. One passage chilled her to the bone. "The threads demand a price. They are not just yarn, not just fabric. They are the very essence of life, of pain, of memory. And the weavers, we are the loom itself, the conduit. We must offer, we must unravel the lives of others to create our own. The well always hungers." Alara discovered accounts of women in Hilda's family, stretching back centuries. Women who were said to have disappeared, only to reappear later, their eyes hollowed, their bodies altered in strange and terrible ways. She found sketches in the journals, disturbing renderings of creatures that seemed to be part woman, part fabric, their bodies woven together in macabre tapestries of flesh and thread. The more she read, the clearer it became that Hilda was not simply losing her mind. She was being consumed by something ancient and hungry. One evening, as a storm raged outside, Hilda called for Alara. She was weaker now, her voice barely more than a whisper, but she held her gaze firm. "The tapestry," she said, her hand trembling as she pointed towards the unfinished work. It needs to be finished. I can't reach it anymore." Alara looked at the tapestry, at the swirling, chaotic patterns that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. She felt a strange compulsion, a pull towards the thing, a need to touch the threads. "What do I do, Aunt Hilda?" she asked, her voice trembling. A faint smile flickered across Hilda's face. "You weave, child. You weave." Part 2. The Unraveling. Alara hesitated. She felt an icy dread crawling up her spine, a primal fear that told her to turn and run. But something compelled her forward, a strange, magnetic pull that she couldn't resist. She reached out a hand, her fingers hovering over the strange, sickly yellow threads. As her skin made contact, a jolt, like an electric shock, ran through her, her vision blurred, and for a moment, she felt as if she were falling, spiraling downwards into an abyss of swirling colors and half-formed images. When she came back, she noticed that the yellow threads of the tapestry seemed to glow. She started to weave. The needle moved almost of its own accord. A strange rhythm permeated the room, a subtle hum emanating from the loom itself. As she worked, images flashed behind her eyes. Fragments of dreams, faces she couldn't quite place, and stories of women long dead, their lives woven into the fabric of the tapestry. She saw a woman with webbed hands, her face obscured by shadow, another with a mouth that stretched into a gaping maw full of needle-like teeth, and another woman who seemed to be made entirely from woven threads, her limbs shifting and unraveling. These were not just random images, she realized. These were the women Hilda had depicted in her journals, women of the Weaver lineage. Days turned into nights as Alara continued to weave, lost in a waking nightmare. She barely ate, barely slept. Her dreams became indistinguishable from reality, blurring into a chaotic tapestry of shifting forms and whispered voices. The room itself seemed to morph and change, the walls pulsing with unseen energy, the shadows moving with a life of their own. And the tapestry, it was getting larger, growing out into the room itself, as though it was an entity of its own reaching out to consume the space around it. One night, she awoke to find herself sprawled on the floor, her body covered in a sheen of cold sweat. The tapestry hummed with a low, resonant thrum, and the yellow threads glowed with an unholy light. As she looked at it, she noticed a new detail that she hadn't seen before. The tapestry now featured a crude depiction of herself, her face distorted and her body wrapped in threads that seemed to be pulling her into the fabric. Panic gripped her. She tried to pull away from the loom, but it felt as if she were bound to it, the threads holding her fast. She clawed at the fabric, desperate to escape, her fingernails tearing through the threads. Each tear brought a surge of pain, not just on her fingers, but deep within her bones. She looked down at her hands, and a horrifying realization washed over her. Her skin was starting to look like the fabric itself, and fine, almost invisible threads seemed to be growing from her flesh, tangling with the tapestry. The loom was not just an object, it was a living thing, and it was turning her into a part of itself. She stumbled back, bumping against the wall. A tapestry on the wall that was depicting a woman with a vacant, hollow gaze seemed to stir. Its painted eyes followed Alara, and its sewn mouth opened in a silent, horrifying scream. She was trapped in a house that was coming alive. The whispers grew louder now. She heard them in the rustling of the curtains, in the creaking of the old house, in the very air she breathed. They spoke of the well, of the weavers, of the endless hunger of the loom. The voices were female, ancient, and filled with a terrible yearning. Ilara realized that these were the voices of the women woven into the tapestry, their spirits trapped within the threads, desperate to be free. She had to escape. She had to find a way to break free of the loom before it consumed her completely. Part 3. The Well Below. Ilara managed to escape the loom room. Her body felt alien, her skin crawling with a strange itching sensation, and she felt the pull of the loom drawing her back. Every inch she moved away was a battle against an unseen force. The house seemed to sense her attempt to escape. The shadows deepened and the house creaked and groaned around her. She stumbled through the cluttered hallways, her mind racing. She remembered a passage in Hilda's journals, reference to a well hidden beneath the house, a place of power and ancient secrets. She reasoned, desperately, that maybe the answer to breaking free lay there. The basement stairs were steep and treacherous, the air below cold and damp. The smell of mildew and something else clung to the air, a scent sickly sweet and vaguely metallic. The stairs seemed to shift and sway as her eyes attempted to follow them, making the descent a terrifying experience. She found it hard to focus, her vision blurring at the edges and her mind racing. The basement was a labyrinth of forgotten objects, cobwebbed shelves, and dusty trunks. In the center of the room, she found it, a well, its stone edges worn smooth with age. The air around it vibrated with an unseen power, and a faint, ethereal glow seemed to emanate from its depths. In the center was an old wooden bucket attached to a rusty chain. She could hear the sloshing of the water below. It sounded heavy and thick. Ilara approached the well cautiously. She peered into the darkness, and she saw something that made her heart stop. Far beneath, she saw faces trapped within the water, their features distorted and their mouths opened in silent screams. These women looked like those depicted in Hilda's tapestries. She dropped to her knees, feeling the cold stone against her skin. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. A chorus of whispers answered her, rising up from the well. The voices spoke of the well, the place where the threads of life and death are spun, where stories are woven into the fabric of existence. They spoke of the weavers, the women who have always been the conduits, who have always offered their lives to the loom. They spoke of a bargain, a terrible pact made long ago, a pact that demands a sacrifice. One of the voices spoke with more clarity than the others. "You are one of us now, Ilara. You are the thread. You are the story. Embrace your role and become part of the tapestry." Terror washed over Ilara. She understood now. The loom wasn't just a tool. It was a trap, a vessel for the souls of the weaver women, and it craved more. She had been chosen, just like the women before her, to continue the cycle. She was supposed to become one of the woven souls, a part of the terrible well. However, the same voice continued. "You can resist if you choose, but the price will be steep. To break the cycle, you must unravel the threads." The voice went on, detailing what Ilara would have to do. She must cut the connections to the loom, but doing this would cost her. She would be left changed, but she would be free. The other voices agreed, pushing her to make the decision. Ilara looked down at her body. Threads now covered her arms and legs, woven into her own skin. She knew what she had to do. She reached toward the well, towards the stories and the voices trapped within. Part 4. Cutting the threads. Ilara knew the task ahead was terrifying. The voices had explained that to break the cycle, she would need to sever her connection to the loom. However, the loom was now part of her, interwoven into her physical being. The only way to cut the threads would be to cut them. She pulled the old bucket from the well, the rusty chain groaning and shaking under the strain. The water was thick and oily, reflecting the dim light in a disturbing way. She dipped her hand in. The water was cold, and she could feel it coating her skin. The threads on her hand seemed to react to it by twisting and pulling. She dragged the bucket out, and a horrible stench filled the chamber, something like rot and decay. She lifted the bucket, the weight of it making her arms ache. She had to start now, before the loom consumed her completely, before she was just another thread in the tapestry. She had to do this, not just for herself, but for the other women trapped within the loom and the well. She knew she had to start with the threads that were so deeply woven into her skin. She carefully took a broken piece of pottery from the nearby shelf, the sharp edges of it feeling rough in her grip. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and then she brought the sharp edge of the shard to her forearm, to the point where the threads seemed to be the most concentrated, and began to cut. The pain was intense, a burning, searing sensation that made her want to scream. But she pushed through, her teeth gritted, determined to break the connection. As she cut, she could feel the threads pulling and twisting, fighting back. The loom room above seemed to shudder and groan, as though in agony. She could feel the other women within the loom, screaming, pleading with her to stop. But she knew what she had to do. She knew she couldn't stop now, not if she was going to break free. She continued to cut, working her way up her arm, the blood mixing with the oily water and the threads, creating a grotesque, sticky mess. The threads were resistant, but her determination was stronger. Each cut brought a surge of pain, but it also brought a step closer to freedom. The skin on her right arm was raw and bleeding, but the threads had been severed. The area felt numb, and she could feel the threads retracting back into her flesh, leaving behind a series of angry welts. She moved to the other arm and repeated the process. The pain was almost unbearable, blurring her vision and making her head spin. But she did not stop. She was fighting for her life, for her soul. When both arms were free of the threads, she moved to her legs. The process was just as agonizing, but she pushed through, driven by a primal need to survive. Her body was a mess of blood, oily water, and severed threads, but she was free. The loom room above was in turmoil. She could hear the screams and the groans, and the sounds of ripping fabric as the tapestry above was shifting and collapsing, the woven women screaming in desperation. The house itself seemed to tremble, its foundations groaning under the immense pressure. She had broken the connection, but she knew it wasn't over yet. The well was still there, still hungry, still filled with the stories and the souls of the women. She knew that she had to find a way to close it. She looked around the basement, desperate for something, anything, that would help her. She saw an old leather satchel and pulled it towards her. Inside were rusted tools and dusty bits of cloth. And then she saw it, a small silver needle, its eye glinting in the dim light. The needle, she realized, was the same type that her Aunt Hilda had used to work the loom. It was the key. Part 5. The tapestry undone. Ilara picked up the needle, her fingers trembling. She could feel the weight of it, the history it had carried for generations. This was the tool of the weavers, the instrument of their power, and she realized that she had to use it to weave a different ending. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and focused her intent. She wasn't going to weave a story of pain and suffering. She was going to weave a story of liberation. She would weave the threads back into the well, binding the past to the present, allowing the trapped spirits to finally find peace. She dipped the needle into the oily water of the well, drawing a thread from the darkness. The thread was thick and dark, and she could sense the pain and the suffering contained within it. She pulled it onto the stone, and laid it in a circle around the well. She continued the process, dipping the needle, drawing the threads from the well, then laying it on the stones, each thread creating a new circle, and each circle pushing the darkness back. As she worked, the whispers from the well began to fade and soften. Their voices were still there, but they no longer sounded like screams. Instead, they became soft sighs, gentle hums, their pain slowly transforming into a sense of calm. The basement seemed to brighten as the darkness receded. The oily water in the well slowly began to clear, the surface becoming reflective. Ilara paused and looked into the water. The faces she had seen earlier were no longer distorted and angry. Now they were clear, their faces calm and peaceful. These were the women of her lineage, the weavers. She noticed that her skin was changing again. The welts were healing, and her wounds had begun to close as new skin was being grown. But the threads were still a part of her, now like silver veins just beneath the surface. Her task was almost done. She closed her eyes again, and then she took the needle and began to reweave the last threads back into the well. This was not like the weaving on the loom. This was different. This felt like she was weaving a story of healing, a story of peace. As she weaved the final thread into place, a gentle hum filled the basement. The well pulsed with a soft, warm light, and then slowly it began to close. The stone edges shifted, and the opening began to shrink, the walls of the well closing together until there was nothing left. There was no more well, no more darkness, only smooth stone. Ilara collapsed, exhausted but at peace. She had done it. She had broken the cycle of the weavers, and she had freed the trapped souls within. She had changed the story. The house above her was silent. Ilara dragged herself up the basement stairs and into the house. It looked different now. The shadows were gone, and the oppressive feeling had lifted. The tapestries were dull and lifeless, and the loom was still, its power finally gone. Ilara walked through the house and outside, the sunlight warm on her face. She was free, changed but free, and she had changed those who came before her, their souls finally at peace. The whispering woods still whispered, but now they were singing their own song, a song of hope and renewal, of a story rewritten. Epilogue. Ilara never forgot the house, the loom, or the well. She carried the silver threads beneath her skin as a constant reminder of her ordeal, and she never again went to the old house. But the weavers, the trapped souls, were free and finally at rest. Ilara, along with the other women of her lineage, had rewritten the story, and that is all that mattered. She went on to live her life, but she would always carry the power within her, the power to weave and unweave the threads of her own life, her own story. She had taken the power for herself, and now she was free. She was the weaver of her own destiny. The Weaver's Loom. Part 1. Threads of Whispers. The village of Blackwood nestled deep within a valley, a place where the sun seemed to shy away. Thick, ancient trees choked the hillsides, their branches gnarled and twisted like the limbs of forgotten giants. The air was perpetually damp, carrying a scent of decaying leaves and something else, something acrid and metallic, that hung heavy in the nostrils. For generations, the women of Blackwood had tended the looms, their hands moving with a practiced grace that bordered on the hypnotic. They wove tapestries, not just of wool and linen, but of life itself. Or so it was said. Agnes, a young woman with eyes the color of river stones and hair like spun moonlight, was the newest apprentice to the loom. She had grown up listening to the tales, the hushed whispers of the older women, stories of the weavers and their ancient power. They spoke of the loom, a massive wooden contraption housed in the old weaving house, a building that always seemed colder than the surrounding air, even on the hottest summer day. Her grandmother, Ilara, a woman with eyes that seemed to see right through you, had been the village's most revered weaver. Ilara was now frail, her hands gnarled with age and arthritis, the loom an aching memory in her bones. She was the keeper of the stories, the one who knew the true nature of their craft. The threads are more than just material. Agnes, Ilara had rasped one evening, her voice like dry leaves rustling across stone. They are the strands of life itself. The loom, it can be a blessing, or it can be a curse. Agnes had never understood what her grandmother meant, her young mind unable to grasp the weight of such words. She had always seen the loom as a source of wonder, a beautiful marvel that transformed raw wool into breathtaking images. Now, as she took her place as an apprentice, the loom seemed to hum with a low, unsettling vibration. The weaving house was a place of quiet industry. The women moved with a fluid grace, their fingers flying across the threads, the rhythmic clack of the shuttles creating a hypnotic beat. Agnes was put to the most mundane of tasks at first, cleaning the tools, organizing the spools, and listening, always listening to the whispers of the older women. The patterns are important, child, Anya, a stocky woman with eyes like polished obsidian, said, her voice low. Each knot, each color, they hold a meaning. Agnes watched them. These women who had toiled at the loom for years, their faces etched with a quiet sadness. They were bound to it, not just by tradition, but by something else, something invisible that held them captive. She saw it in the way they avoided each other's gazes, and the way they never spoke of the village before the weaving house. One day, while cleaning a corner of the room, Agnes stumbled across a hidden niche behind a loose stone. Inside, she found a small leather-bound book, its pages brittle with age. The book was filled with strange symbols and drawings, most of which were faded and illegible. However, one drawing caught her eye, a depiction of the loom, surrounded by writhing, serpent-like figures. The loom was not depicted as a simple machine, but as a creature of bone and wood, its threads reaching out like grasping tentacles. Agnes felt a tremor of fear run through her. The book felt cold in her hands, as if it held some ancient, malevolent energy. She quickly tucked it away. The image of the monstrous loom burned into her mind. That night, Agnes had a dream. She saw the weaving house, but it was not as she knew it. The walls were made of bone. The threads of the loom were red and pulsing, and the women were not weaving tapestries, but ensnaring shadows. The loom pulsed with a dark light, its wooden frame groaning with ancient hunger. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The following days were marked by a growing unease. Agnes noticed subtle changes in the village. The air seemed heavier, the shadows deeper, and the women, including even her grandmother, seemed more distant, their eyes holding a peculiar glint. The rhythmic clack of the loom began to sound less like work and more like a mournful plea. One afternoon, while working beside Anya, Agnes saw a pattern emerge on the tapestry the woman was weaving, a pattern that looked disturbingly familiar. It was the same writhing, serpent-like figures she had seen in the book. Agnes gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Anya looked at her with a knowing, chilling smile. "The loom speaks to us, child," Anya said, her voice a soft, unsettling rasp. "It tells us what must be woven." Agnes realized with a rising sense of horror that the women were not controlling the loom. The loom was controlling them, and whatever it was weaving, it was not of this world. Part 2. The Tapestry of Fear. Agnes became consumed by her fear. She started to avoid the weaving house, finding excuses not to go each day. She spent her days poring over the strange book, trying to decipher the symbols, hoping to find some clue, some hint about the true nature of the loom. She learned that the women had not always been weavers. They were once healers, protectors of the village. But something happened. something that twisted their ancient knowledge. She learned that the loom had been forged from the heartwood of a cursed tree, a tree that had been soaked in blood, a tree that held a deep, malevolent power. The book spoke of a ritual, a dark ceremony that had been performed many centuries ago, a ceremony that had bound the women to the loom. It was not a blood pact, but a thread pact, a binding of their souls to the tapestry of the weaver. The book warned that once bound, there was no escape. Agnes realized with a sickening dread that the women were not just weaving tapestries. They were weaving the very fabric of their reality. The patterns they created were not just for decoration, but were altering the world around them, drawing in shadows and feeding the hunger of the loom. One moonless night, Agnes decided she had to confront her grandmother, Elara. She found her in her small, dimly lit cottage, sitting by the fire, her eyes staring blankly into the flames. "Grandmother," Agnes said, her voice trembling, "tell me the truth. What is the loom? What is happening to the village?" Elara turned to her slowly, her eyes filled with a bottomless sorrow. "The loom," she rasped, "it is not just wood and thread. It is a living thing. It hungers, Agnes, it always hungers, and we are its sustenance." She explained to Agnes that the loom had been awakened by the blood of women, the sacrifice of women bound to its threads, and the weaver's soul that had been broken by its power. She went on to tell her that long ago, the first weavers tried to use the power for good, but the darkness within the loom warped their intentions, twisting their abilities into something monstrous. She told her that each generation had tried to stem the darkness, but the loom grew stronger with time. The patterns we weave, they are not just pretty pictures. They are the fabric of our reality. We feed the loom with our fears, our sorrows, our hopes, and they all become twisted into something else. It is consuming us, child, and now it desires more. Agnes felt a wave of horror wash over her. She realized that she, too, was being pulled into the loom's web, her fears and anxieties woven into the tapestry of the village. The loom was leeching the very life out of her, feeding on her essence. "Is there no way to stop it, grandmother?" Agnes asked, her voice desperate. Elara looked at her, her gaze filled with a sorrowful determination. "There is a way, an ancient ritual recorded in the book, a way to unravel the threads. But it is dangerous, Agnes, very dangerous." She explained that the ritual required the blood of the first weavers, the blood that had awakened the loom, the blood now woven into the very core of the tapestries. It required not only courage, but also the sacrifice of the weavers themselves. "The loom will try to stop you, Agnes. It will fight back." That night, Agnes couldn't sleep. The weight of the responsibility was crushing her. She knew that she had to try, not just for herself, but for the other women, for the entire village. She had to unravel the threads of the loom before it consumed them all. The next morning, Agnes went to the weaving house, her heart pounding in her chest. The loom hummed with a palpable anticipation, the rhythmic click of the shuttles sounding like a dark heartbeat. The women were weaving, their movements jerky and unnatural. She could feel the loom's influence on them, its dark energy seeping into their bodies. She pulled out the book, her hands trembling, and began to read the ancient words aloud, her voice echoing through the silent hall. At first, nothing happened. The women continued to weave, their eyes fixed on their work, paying no mind to her. She read the words louder, her voice gaining strength and confidence. The air inside the weaving house began to grow cold. The threads of the loom started to tremble, and the rhythmic click slowed, then stuttered. The women stopped their weaving, their eyes, which had been glazed with a strange detachment before, now held a flicker of confusion and fear. Agnes continued her reading, the ancient words resonating in her soul. She closed her eyes, the symbols burning into her mind. She felt a searing pain in her chest, a burning sensation like a thread being pulled from her very core. She realized that the ritual was working. The loom was fighting back, trying to break the thread between its influence and her soul. The women around her started to scream, their hands clutching at their chests, the threads of the loom seeming to pull them towards it. Agnes opened her eyes and saw the loom writhing, the wooden frame creaking and groaning as if in pain. The tapestries it held were twisting and contorting, the patterns turning into monstrous shapes as if trying to crawl out of the woven fabric. Anya, her face contorted in a mask of horror, lunged at Agnes, her hands reaching out like claws. Agnes stumbled backward, her eyes never leaving the monstrous form of the loom. She had to stay strong. She had to complete the ritual. Part 3. Unraveling the threads. Agnes knew that the loom was trying to ensnare her, feed her into the tapestry of its dark design. She began to chant the ancient texts louder, her voice resonating with the power of generations that had come before her. The air began to crackle with energy. The tapestry started to unravel as if some unseen hand was tearing through the woven threads. The loom shrieked in protest, a sound like splintering wood and twisted metal, its frame groaning under the strain. The women around her, no longer under the loom's absolute spell, were stumbling back, their faces etched with horror at the sight of the monstrous creature that had enslaved them for so long. Some were crying, others were praying, as if trying to cleanse themselves of the darkness that had permeated their souls. Agnes saw a way to accelerate the unraveling. The book spoke of a specific thread, the one that had bound them to the loom, a thread woven from the blood and essence of the first weaver. It had to be cut, but the loom was protecting it. The thread started moving with a life of their own, snaking around her as if trying to choke her. Agnes knew her time was running out. She plunged her hand into the moving mass of threads, desperately searching for the one. It felt as if she was reaching into a living nightmare, the threads burning, biting, and pulling at her flesh. She found it. It was thicker, darker red than the others, pulsing with a malevolent energy. It was the one the book had described, the thread of origin, the one that had bound them all. With a surge of adrenaline, Agnes, using a sharp weaving knife, cut through the thread. The loom screeched, the sound echoing through the village, a sound of absolute pain and rage. The tapestries twisted and writhed before disintegrating into dust. The weaving house was plunged into darkness as the loom died down. The threads fell lifeless onto the floor. A cold breeze rushed through the room as if something enormous had been released. The weight of the centuries lifted off of the village. The other women collapsed to the floor, their bodies shaking. They were free now, but they were also broken and traumatized. The loom had left them with deep scars on their souls, scars that would take a long time to heal, if they ever would. Agnes herself fell to her knees, exhausted and drained. She felt a strange sense of lightness, mixed with an overwhelming weariness. She had done it. She had broken the loom's hold on the village. But the book warned that the loom, or what it had become, would not stay gone forever. The heart would. The blood, the pain, they had not just vanished. It was dormant, waiting. The women of Blackwood had only bought themselves time. Agnes knew that she had to keep the knowledge of the loom alive. This was her solemn responsibility to future generations of women. She knew that the stories had to be shared, the lessons had to be learned and passed on. She had to make sure that no woman of Blackwood would ever again fall victim to the darkness that lurked within the threads. Part 4. The Legacy of Whispers. The village of Blackwood slowly began to heal. The air grew lighter, the shadows less deep, and you could feel the life returning to the village. The women, though still bearing the scars of their ordeal, began to rebuild, their bonds to each other forged in shared trauma, forging them stronger. The weaving house remained empty, a somber reminder of the darkness that had once held them captive. Agnes decided to close the weaving house and keep the loom under lock and key, in a place that would not be readily accessible to anyone. She created a new space for the women, a sanctuary. They started a small garden, planting herbs and flowers that had been forgotten during the time of the loom, the scent of life filling the air. They began to heal each other, sharing their stories, their fears, and their hopes. They rediscovered the old ways, the ways of healing and protection that had been stolen from their ancestors. They no longer wove tapestries of thread and wool. They began to weave a new tapestry of sisterhood, strength, and hope. Agnes, now the new keeper of the stories, passed down the history of the loom to the younger women, not with fear, but with a deep sense of purpose. She told them about the mistakes of the past, the dangers of unchecked power, and the importance of staying true to oneself. She taught them how to recognize the signs, the whispers of the loom, should it ever try to rise again. Years passed, and Agnes grew old, her hair turning the color of silver, her skin marked with the wisdom and experience of a life lived in the shadow of the loom. But her eyes still held a spark, a fire that would never be extinguished. She had become a symbol of strength and resilience for the women of Blackwood, a beacon of hope in a world that was still shrouded in darkness. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley, Agnes sat by the fire, her granddaughter Lyra sitting beside her, her eyes wide with curiosity. Lyra had been listening to the stories of the loom since she was a little girl, and she was now ready to carry on the legacy. "Grandmother," Lyra asked, her voice soft, "will the loom ever come back?" Agnes looked at her, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. She knew that the darkness was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to rise again. "Perhaps, child," Agnes said, her voice raspy with age. "But we will be ready. We will never forget what happened here, and we will always protect each other." She took Lyra's hand and placed it on her own. Their connection was profound, a lineage of women bound by a common history, tied together by the threads of the past, present, and the future. Agnes knew that the fight was not over. The darkness was always there, waiting, but the women of Blackwood would never give in. They would forever be vigilant, their souls forever connected, bound together by the stories, the warnings, and the legacy of the loom. They would always be ready to unravel its threads, should it ever try to rise again. The women of Blackwood had become more than just weavers. They had become guardians, protectors of their own stories, the embodiment of resilience and determination. They had transformed the horror of their past into a source of enduring strength and hope. The tapestry of their lives was woven now not by fear, but by courage, not by desperation, but by a powerful and profound bond of sisterhood. They would continue to live, to learn and to fight, weaving their own destiny, thread by thread, into the fabric of time. Epilogue. Many years later, the village of Blackwood had changed. The weaving house was gone, replaced by a garden, vibrant with life and the echoes of laughter. The women were free, their bonds to each other now unbreakable. But the story of the weaver's loom was still told, a reminder of the price of unchecked power and the immeasurable strength of female resilience. And always, in the back of every woman's heart, was the understanding that the threads of darkness were waiting, dormant, and could potentially be unleashed once more. They were vigilant, ready, and above all, united. Subscribe to Hollow Whisper Tales and unlock the secrets of the night. Story number 3. Title: The Salt of Her Skin. Part 1. The Echo of the Well. Ilara, a woman in her late 30s, returns to her childhood home in Oakhaven, a secluded village nestled deep within a valley. She's been estranged from her family for years, a wound still raw despite the passing time. Her mother, Maeve, has recently passed away, leaving Alara the sole inheritor of the old, crumbling farmhouse and the secrets it guards. Oakhaven feels like a place preserved in amber, untouched by modernity, and clinging to its superstitious beliefs. Alara, a successful architect in the city, feels like an alien in this suffocating environment. The women of Oakhaven, weathered, silent, and watchful, regard her with a mixture of suspicion and pity. Their eyes, the color of faded slate, seem to know things she doesn't. The house itself is a character, filled with the oppressive weight of generations past. Sunlight struggles to penetrate the thick walls, and the air hangs heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. Alara finds Maeve's journal tucked away in a dusty chest. The entries are filled with disjointed phrases, cryptic warnings about the well and the hollow women, and pleas for forgiveness to a figure only referenced as her. Alara dismisses these entries as the ramblings of a woman consumed by grief and isolation. She focuses on cataloging and preparing the house for sale, eager to leave Oakhaven and return to her life. However, strange occurrences begin to plague her. Whispers carry on the wind, even when the air is still. The creaking of the house seems to form words, and she keeps seeing fleeting shadows out of the corner of her eye. She meets Mrs. Ainsworth, the elderly matriarch of Oakhaven, who warns her to leave the house untouched. Some things are best left buried, she says, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Your mother, God rest her soul. She tried to fight it, but the well it always takes. Alara dismisses this as old wives' tales, but with each passing day, the strangeness intensifies, and the journal entries become increasingly unsettling. She finds a page which talks about being chosen, and a ritual performed by the women, invoking her. She starts having nightmares about the well at the edge of the property, a dark, gaping maw in the earth, seemingly bottomless. In the dream, she sees pale, skeletal figures rising from the murky depths, their faces contorted in silent screams. These nightmares begin to bleed into the waking world, making sleep a torturous ordeal. The first sign of true horror occurs when Alara finds a small, intricately carved wooden doll in her mother's room. The doll is disturbingly lifelike, with the same pale skin and vacant eyes as the figures in her dreams. It's wearing a miniature dress similar to one she remembers seeing the women of Oakhaven wear. Upon closer examination, she notices that the doll's mouth is slightly open, as if in mid-whisper. The same night, she hears guttural vocalizations coming from the walls. This is no longer the harmless creaking of an old house. Alara is starting to feel like she not only inherited a house, but something far more terrifying. Part 2. The Hollow Ones. Approximate 6,000 words. Alara, now thoroughly unnerved, decides to investigate the well despite Mrs. Ainsworth's warning. She finds that it's not just a well, but a deep, man-made shaft, lined with stones that seem slick and strangely organic. The air around it is cold, and a strange, floral scent hangs in the air, a scent that makes her feel nauseous and lightheaded. As she peers into its depths, she thinks she sees movement, a flash of pale limbs deep below. Alara throws a stone into the well and waits, but there is no sound of it hitting water, just the dull thud of it landing on something soft, followed by a quiet, rustling sound that seems to echo in her skull. Desperate for answers, she begins to delve into her family history and discovers a horrifying truth. The women of Oakhaven have been bound to an ancient pact for generations, a ritual performed to appease a being they refer to only as her that dwells within the earth. This being, she learns from faded local records, is not a deity but a monstrous entity that feeds on the pain, sorrow, and fear of the women. The pact, passed down through mothers to daughters, requires them to offer a part of themselves, initially a token, later an actual offering of themselves during a ceremony performed at the well. The hollow women of her mother's journal are not simply figures of folklore, but women who were consumed by the ritual, their bodies and souls twisted and broken by her. Ilara's mother had resisted this fate, which seems to be the cause of her own personal suffering, according to her journal. Her resistance has inadvertently made Ilara the next target. The more Ilara uncovers, the more malevolent the atmosphere of the house becomes. She catches glimpses of the hollow women in the periphery, their pale, gaunt faces peering from the shadows. They no longer seem to be just apparitions, but something far more substantial. The wooden doll she found now looks like it's been posed in different positions each morning. It seems to be watching her. Even more terrifying, she starts to experience physical changes. Her hair is thinning and her skin is starting to feel strangely cold, not unlike the figure she sees in the shadows. She realizes that the pact is not just a legend. It's a living curse that is beginning to claim her. She sees other women in town in similar states of decay, and sees the hollow eyes staring back at her. Ilara tries to leave Oakhaven, but a strange force seems to hold her captive. The roads twist and turn, bringing her back to the village each time. She is trapped, a pawn in the ancient game of fear and sacrifice. She turns to the women of Oakhaven, but they only stare blankly at her, their eyes hollow, their bodies moving in a strange, robotic manner. They all seem to be bound to something, their minds lost to whatever lurks beneath. During one sleepless night, Ilara finds a hidden passage in the basement, a narrow tunnel leading away from the house. Hope flares briefly, but she immediately feels as if she's being watched. She enters the tunnel, feeling a chill in her bones she can't explain. This is no ordinary tunnel, she realizes. It's a pathway deep into the earth. She follows it, the air growing thick and heavy, the rustling sound she heard earlier now a constant presence. She emerges in a cavern lit by an unnatural, subterranean glow. At its center, a vast chasm plunges into the darkness, and a strange, pulsing energy resonates from deep within. The air is thick with the scent of decay, the same floral scent now amplified, making her choke and gag. She hears whispers, countless voices murmuring her name. It's here she finally understands. Her is not just in the well. Her is the earth itself, a living entity that feeds on the fear and despair of the women of Oakhaven. The well is just one point of entry into a network that spans deep beneath the surface. Part 3. The Pact Undone. Approximate 7,000 words. Ilara realizes that running won't save her. The pact is deeply ingrained in the land. She must confront her directly, and by extension the corrupted women of her family. Ilara decides that her only weapon is her own mind and will. She spends days studying her mother's journals more closely, poring over every word, looking for clues. What she uncovers is that her is not invincible. She is sustained by the fear and submission of the women. The ritual is not just an offering, but an act of surrender. Her mother's journal notes how her can be starved by refusing to succumb. Ilara realizes that breaking the cycle requires a collective act of defiance. She begins to unravel the threads of the pact and finds that the women of Oakhaven had a means of protecting themselves centuries ago, before her corrupted their ways, a means her mother had written down that they had seemingly forgotten. It is not a weapon to fight her directly. Instead, it is a way to sever the connection, to starve her. It involved specific rituals, specific words, and specific actions performed in unison. It becomes a desperate race against time. Ilara starts performing these actions herself, focusing her will, her rage, and her own grief. She uses the knowledge she gathered from her mother's notes, performing a counter-ritual. This makes the Hollow Ones grow restless. They turn from silent observers into tormentors, their whispers turning into mocking laughter, their gaunt faces leering inches from hers. They try to use her fears and doubts against her, to make her surrender, to make her give in. They attempt to lure her deeper into the caverns, further into the embrace of her. Ilara's resolve falters, but she remembers the faces of her ancestors, the women who willingly followed this path. Her own mother, not completely broken, still fighting even to the end. She finds hidden strength in their quiet resilience and pushes forward. She knows she can't do it alone. She has to reach the other women of the village. She finds them going through their daily routines, trapped in their hollow state. Though most look vacant, Ilara sees flickers of recognition in their eyes and knows that they can still hear her, can still understand. Ilara starts to whisper the words of the counter-ritual, slowly, deliberately. She focuses her will, her voice echoing in Oakhaven. Some begin to mimic her, the words strange on their tongues, but there is a flicker of recognition there. The Hollow Ones become more agitated as the women begin to awaken from their stupor. As more and more women join the counter-ritual, a wave of power emanates from them, creating a powerful force that reaches deep into the earth. The ground trembles, the walls of the house crack, and the unnatural glow in the cavern fades. The whispers now turn to screams, a mix of pain and rage. Her is fighting back, desperate to hold onto her power. She sends her Hollow Ones, now ravenous, to stop the women, but the counter-ritual had taken effect and the women, together, begin to overpower them. They are fueled by a power that comes not from fear, but from their collective will. The very air begins to feel lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. As more women join in, the power of the counter-ritual reaches a crescendo. The Hollow Ones start to return to the dust from which they came, their screams echoing and fading. The women begin to regain their own memories, their own selves, their eyes no longer hollow, but filled with a newfound strength. They are no longer pawns in a monstrous game. Part 4, Salt and Memory, approximate 2,000 words. The intensity of the ritual subsides, leaving behind an eerie quiet. The ground no longer trembles, the whispers are gone, and the oppressive atmosphere of Oakhaven lifts. The wooden doll in Ilara's room falls apart, its pieces turning to dust, freed from the malevolent energy that animated it. The well, now no longer a gaping maw to the earth, is filled with water, pure and clear. Ilara, though exhausted, feels strangely at peace. The women of Oakhaven, no longer hollow, gather around her, their eyes filled with gratitude and a silent understanding. They are not the same women they were before. They carry the scars of her, and they carry the memories of their suffering. But they are free. Ilara works with the women to rebuild Oakhaven. Not just the buildings, but the community. The old ways are not forgotten, but instead reimagined, imbued with the spirit of defiance and strength. She doesn't leave Oakhaven. The house is no longer a place of horror, but a place of memory and resilience. She decides to stay and become a part of its story, a story of survival and the power of women united. She finds that she finally understands why her mother did not leave Oakhaven, why she fought until the very end, not for herself but for her daughter, for all the daughters to come. She now carries the knowledge of the past and the hope for the future. She knows that her is not entirely gone, will likely always remain a part of the earth. This knowledge doesn't frighten her, it empowers her, because now they are all armed with the means to fight it. They will no longer be silent victims. The story concludes with Ilara walking to the edge of the property and looking at the well, which is now used for water. She sees her reflection in it. Her skin, once pale, now has a healthy glow. and her eyes are clear and bright. She takes a pinch of salt from the pocket of her jacket and throws it into the well. She knows that the salt, the symbol of preservation, will help them to never forget, to always remember the women who came before and the strength they found in each other. They will never let themselves become hollow again. They will carry the salt of their own skin with them always.